Okay, welcome back to the Non-Physicalist View of Consciousness workshop sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation. Thanks very much for coming, and our first talk today will be by Bram, Vaassen, and he'll be talking to us about mental causation for naturalist dualists.
Right. Thank you very much. So, the title of this talk is Mental Causation for Naturalist Dualists. What we're going to talk about is basically the idea that those dualists who have been calling themselves epiphenomenalists, which we've met one by now, the purpose of my project is more or less looking into ideas of causation that might even grant these people mental causation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the setup of the problem. Why is it so obvious or assumed by even these philosophers themselves that they can't have mentally causally efficient conscious states? Then I'm going to look at one solution that has been offered by Thomas. He suggests we should develop a counterfactual account of causation and make a slight shift in the ontology of mind within naturalist dualism. I don't believe that's going to work. I think there's problems. I'm going to address them. Then I'm going to offer an alternative solution, which I believe to be superior. But I'm still going to raise an objection for that solution as well, and consider some possible solutions to the final objections, even though I'm not myself entirely convinced by them. I do believe that this would be the way to go if you want to try to give epiphenomenalists mental causation. Right. So if we start with what I have called the sloppy premise, I started with that because I was just making a graph, but then I noticed that actually in the dialectics of the debate, this is as much as you get of an argument. In most of the cases, zombie-style dualism cannot accommodate causally potent conscious states. So when I say zombie-style dualism, I mean the kind of dualism that is motivated by the idea that there's metaphysically possible worlds with zombies in them. So there's a metaphysically possible world which is a physical duplicate of our world, but it contains no conscious states whatsoever. I'm going to make a nice informative drawing of the idea. The idea is something like this. We have the actual world, which I very aptly use this sign for. And then we get these similarity spheres of possible worlds around this world. One are the nomologically possible worlds. So these are the worlds which are possible given our world and given the laws of nature that hold in our world. So let's assume that there's a world in which it is nomologically possible that I was wearing different shoes. This is a world which falls within the similarity sphere within this circle. Then there's another circle you could draw, which is larger, and this is and for natural laws. This is the similarity sphere of metaphysically possible worlds. So within this sphere would be a world in which gravity works upwards or some other natural law fails to hold, but all the laws of metaphysics are still in place. So if you want to be an essentialist about water and H2O, a world in which water is not H2O falls outside this similarity sphere. I'm going to draw one more sphere. So these are the logical laws. I'm not going to talk about these at all, so we can forget about those. So the idea is more or less, there's a zombie world, and the zombie world is located here. Right. It's a nomologically possible world. It's a nomologically impossible world, but it is still metaphysically possible. That's more or less the idea.
You ask questions during the talk.
I think we'll wait till afterwards. Yeah. And the idea of the naturalist dualist is the following. Conscious states are nomologically determined by subvariant physical states, so there are psychophysical laws which have the strength of a modal nomological law. Therefore, it's possible to sort of break this nomological law, keep all the laws of metaphysics still in place, and have a zombie world. Now, it's also plausible that the purported effects of conscious states are nomologically determined by their subvenient physical state. So let's say I have a brain state which subvenes my pain quality. Purportedly, this would nomologically determine a certain effect, me taking aspirin or something like that. And in more or less the same way, it nomologically determines the quale I actually have, so what it's likeness of my pain. That's the view you get. And it seems pretty plausible that there's no causal efficacy of conscious states on this picture. For one thing, the naturalist dualist adheres to something that I would call the nomological closure of the physical. So there is no nomological determination of any state, of any physical state in our world by anything else than another physical state. So the physical is nomologically closed. Another worry you'll get is the common cause scenario. That is to say, any correlation we will find between qualia or qualia, I will use this interchangeably, and purported effects such as me taking aspirins will be well enough explained by the mere fact that they have a cause in common, so to speak, the subvenient conscious state. So if you're saying as a naturalist dualist, well, we have this massive correlation, there's this perfectly good explanation for that without appealing to causation. Then there's a final reason I think that naturalist dualists are taking to have no mental causation. One move within philosophy of mind is to say that conscious states or mental states derive their causal power from the physical states subvening them. But as a dualist, you are positing the weakest possible modal link between conscious states and physical states. Not the weakest possible, but the weakest possible in the contemporary playing field of philosophy of mind. So if you want to say that somehow our mental states derive, or conscious states derive their causal power from the physical states subvening them, you're in the weakest dialectical position, because all other taken positions in contemporary philosophy of mind posit a stronger link between conscious states and their subvening states. Right, so now I'm going forward to Krödel's proposed solution. Krödel proposes we adopt Lewisian counterfactualism about causation. I'm not going to go very deep into it, into that picture itself, Lewisian counterfactualism, but it's good to have a grasp of what they actually mean. So more or less the view is this: causation is defined as follows: E causally depends on C if and only if C necessitates E and not C necessitates not E. The idea being something like, if a cause hadn't occurred, the effect hadn't occurred as well, either, and if a cause occurs, the effect will occur. The semantics of necessitates, or the box arrow, is the following: C necessitates E is true if and only if there is a possible world where C and E hold, which is closer to the actual world than any possible world where C and not E holds. I think this needs some elaboration on what we mean by closeness of possible worlds. This is also why I made this magnificent drawing. So what determines the closeness or the geography amongst possible worlds? There's two criteria to be held in place according to Krödel, and he takes this directly from Lewis. First of all, the force of the modal law that has been broken. So, as you see here, a possible world which breaks a metaphysical law, which falls here within the similarity spheres. For example, a world in which water is not H2O, assuming some things about natural kind properties, is further away than one in which a nomological law is broken. So water falls up for a minute or so. That possible world in which that happens is closer to our world because the force of the modal law that has been broken is weaker. That's one. Number two is the overall spatio-temporal similarity of the two worlds. So a world in which the water falls upward, the rain falls upwards for a minute or so is gonna be more like the world in which rain falls upwards for 2 hours or so, because the overall spatio-temporal similarity between those two worlds is less for a world in which rain falls upwards for 2 hours straight. Right. Now let's look at this account of causation. What do we want from it? Does it work? Well, the example is, after heavy rain, my lawn is wet and I crash my car on slippery roads. Does it hold that the rain caused my lawn to get wet? Yes, because the relevant counterfactuals hold. If it rains, my lawn gets wet. If it hadn't rained, my lawn wouldn't have been wet. Did the rain cause the car crash? Well, yes, assuming that it was due to slippery roads. If it rains, I crash my car. If it hadn't rained, I probably wouldn't have crashed my car. Doing that, aside from that, we can also exclude some non-causal relations as being non-causal on the account itself. Namely, the wetness of my lawn did not cause my car crash. So the common cause worry is sort of averted. You don't get situations in which two events which share a common cause come out as being causally related itself. Namely, the closest possible world in which my lawn didn't get wet would be one in which my lawn sort of magically did not get wet. We make a slight shift in the laws of nature, which makes my lawn very absorbent, or which sort of magically makes it dry in any way you want. I would still have crashed my car because the roads would still have been wet, so to speak. If you wanna create a possible world in which both my lawn didn't get wet and I didn't crash my car, you will have to change either more nomological laws or make the world less spatio-temporally similar. Now let's look at what this does for qualia on the naturalist dualist account. Suppose I have a terrible headache quale which nomologically supervenes on some physical state, and then I decide to take an aspirin. Long story short, the physical state will count as a cause for taking an aspirin, but the quale won't count as a cause for taking an aspirin. For the closest possible world in which I did not have this quale is where the nomological law connecting my quale to the subvenient state is just failed to hold. So to put this very figuratively, you can sort of cut the natural law connecting my quale to the physical state. So the quale doesn't occur, but the physical state did still occur, and thereby I will still be taking aspirins. I'm just some sort of temporary zombie. So dualist qualia are still epiphenomenal, and this is obviously due to the weakness of the laws you posit between physical states and qualia, the psychophysical laws you posit between physical states and qualia. Krell comes with a solution which is quite nifty and in a way obvious. He says, well, all you have to do is claim that psychophysical laws are super nomological. They are stronger than regular nomological laws, but they are weaker than metaphysical laws. So what Krell does on this picture is just he adds one similarity sphere of the super nomological. Which makes it the case that all worlds in which you break a supernomological law are suddenly, on this geography, more distant than worlds in which you break regular nomological laws. So formally, it will work because you're not allowed to cut the quale out of the system. You're going to be forced to change, to take out the physical state and the quale at the same time, and thereby you will not have the effect. So these things come out as true. According to the Lewisian counterfactualist idea of causation, you will have causally efficacious qualia. And in fairness to Krill, his paper is way longer than what I'm presenting here. He also addresses a redirected version of causal exclusion arguments, which also formally works. I think the problem is not there. I think the problem is that the central claim itself is in tension with both dualism and Lewisian counterfactualism. That is to say, to posit supernomological dualism is actually to go against the main tenets of dualism, and to posit it and then apply Lewisian counterfactualism will give you the wrong kind of causal claims. So, to begin with the first thing, supernomological dualism is either problematically ad hoc or unstable. So as I said, his solution is fairly straightforward, but it's also so obvious. And there is no independent motivation. There is no motivation for the claim that the laws connecting the physical to consciousness are modally stronger than any other nomological laws. Moreover, this is exactly what makes naturalist dualism a distinct position within contemporary philosophy. The idea that it is not the case that these laws are any stronger. And if you're going to motivate some reason why this law should be modally stronger, you're very likely to end up in a position you just opposed to. Non-reductionist physicalism. You're going to argue for something stronger, which is going to look like Constitution or another metaphysical law, which is exactly what you oppose to. And still, you are in an awkward dialectical position because you're still positing the nomologically, the modally weakest link, because you still want to distinguish yourself from metaphysical, from non-reductionist physicalism. So you sort of posit this, you have this ad hoc postulate, and you're not allowed to talk about it, because if you argue for it further, you're at risk of becoming a non-reductionist physicalist, and if you don't argue for it further, then it's ad hoc still. The other problem, and this applies to Lewisian counterfactualism more than the ontology itself, we're still in a common cause scenario. So by your own lights, it's the case that the physical state caused the quale, and that the physical state caused me to take an aspirin. And it is in virtue of these relations that the quale will end up being causally effective towards me taking an aspirin. So you're in a situation in which something is causal in virtue of sharing a cause. Two things are causally related as cause and effect itself in virtue of sharing a common cause, which doesn't seem like a healthy situation. I propose that counterfactualism cannot help the dualist because it still requires that mental states inherit their causal powers from the underlying physical states. So we should actually, as a dualist, you should focus on the properties of mental states qua mental states, rather than their relation to the physical state, because that's where you are in your weakest dialectical position. So you should look at properties of the mental states as mental states and how these properties relate to their purported effects. This is where we go to the more positive part of my presentation. I think such a view has been offered by John Campbell, although he has recently decided to drop the view more or less. But let's stick with it for now. So the sloppy solution to my sloppy premise is, what if we propose that causation is a relation between salient variables whose values systematically correlate under certain interventions? And I'm going to use two examples by Campbell to illustrate this. So Campbell talks about a volume knob. So the volume knob on your radio correlates that the values of the volume knob on your radio correlates systematically to certain values about the volume that actually is emitted by your radio. Number 1 will correlate nicely to a certain value. Number 2 will correlate nicely to a certain value up until the maximum volume, right? So to make it very childishly simple, you're gonna get a situation like this, where this is the volume, this is the volume knob, and you have this very nice relation matching everything in that way. And that is, you'll get a systematic relation between the values of the cause variable and the values of the effect variable. And not only that, once you have this nice correlation between them, it will also be very obvious why you have organized the values of the variable in this way. This will always be +1, +1, +1. They stand into, they're salient variables in the sense that they are organized in a very intuitive way to our minds. So this holds for a volume knob and the volume emitted by your radio, but this will also hold for a lot of mental variables, right? My belief that I had to be here at 8:30 correlates perfectly with my, or correlates very systematically with my arriving here at 8:30. If I had believed it was 8:45, I would have arrived here at 8:45. So we'll get this same kind of systematical correlation. And it's the same kind of salient variable you posit. And I believe that, if anything, why do we believe that qualia cause something? It's because we have the same kind of systematical relations going on between qualia and our behavior. The intensity of my pain qualia will systematically correlate with some of my behavior. So, although this seems like a nice fit for the problem, it also seems as much too nice a fit as Grödel's solution seems like too nice a fit. This conception of causation seems too convenient for the dualist. Moreover, it's sort of lightweight, it doesn't cut very deep, and it is perspectivist. It depends on what we perceive as salient variables or what we perceive as systematical correlation. Now, what I want to say is that causation as a lightweight and perspectivist relation is actually more motivated by philosophy of causation than most of the other notions of causation that play in philosophy of mind. There are two considerations that I believe favor the idea of introducing causation as a relation, as a systematical relation between salient variables, namely negative and the Thymus symmetry of causation. Very big topics in philosophy of causation. I'll look at them in this order. So negative causation, for example, has been a problem for a very long time. The idea is something not occurring can be a cause. My plants can die by me not watering them. I can get sunburned at a certain spot by not using the right kind of sunscreen at that spot. It might seem at first hand that this is just a pragmatic way to denote another causal process, which is actually entirely positive. But Jonathan Schaffer has remarked that causation by emissions and double prevention, which is another kind of causation by emissions, is too pervasive in patently causal processes to be waived as second-grade causation. So he gives an example which I put in the handout. If you assume, if you want to say that somebody shooting someone through the heart is a causal process, but throughout this whole process there are so many omissions doing the causes that if you want to say, oh, this is all just second-grade causation, you'll be talking about something completely different as first-rate causation than the relation we actually use to talk about, when we talk about causation. And related to this, you don't want to be too inclusive about the omissions. So me not watering my plants, that caused my plants to die. My neighbor not watering my plants, maybe, depends on whether I have an agreement with my neighbor. Donald Trump not watering my plants, well, the man is doing a lot of horrible stuff, but my plants shouldn't be complaining about Donald Trump. So there seems to be a criterion of salience in selecting causes. When we talk about omissions, what makes an omission causally effective? Well, the fact that it's a salient fact that the omission occurred, or that the alternative did not occur. Another issue, which points both to salience, I think, and to the necessity of a notion of systematicity in the causal relation, is the so-called Thymus symmetry of causation. So let's start with a very plausible assumption, or even posit about the causal relation. In the actual world, causes precede their effects. This is something we want to have in place. But in order to have this in place, you're going to come across a lot of problems. If you want to say that causes determine their effects, there are also, if we just look at the entire world, there are also so-called post-determiners, namely states that follow an effect, which by the laws of nature determine that the effect has actually occurred before it. So how do we want to distinguish post-determiners from causes? Well, there's huge literature on this. But one way which has sort of has been posited by people who blow away all this literature and say that it can be helped, except if you that the best way to distinguish between causes and post-determiners is to notice not the force of the determination relation, but look at what kind of states it are that are post-determiners and how they relate to the effect systematically. So the idea is something like this. There is nothing intrinsically different between backwards determination and forward determination. But what is different is that if we look at a state that backwardly determines my being here, for example, this is going to be this huge gerrymandered state of which includes protons being in certain positions and not in any other position. Right? The proton couldn't have been like 1 nanomillimeter to the left or something like that. Because if that had, that state would post-determine an entirely different state in which the world has just exploded or something of the like. So to wrap this up rather shortly, Alan Elia said, the backwards process is fragile in a sense in which the forward process is not. That is to say what I just said. If you take the post-determiner of me being here and you change the position of one molecule, this will it will no longer be the post-determiner of me being here. It will post-determine some hugely different state, which is nothing like me being here. Whereas if you take some sort of cause of me being here, namely me sending an email, and instead of kind regards, I set all best into when sending this email, I would still have been here. Right? It's this salient state, and there's a systematical correlation between me being here and some of its causes. So you can sort of systematically intervene upon this cause and thereby systematically make changes to why I'm here. Whereas you can't do this with post-determinants. So the collection of backward determining states with similar effects has no intrinsic unity. It is a gerrymandered collection. It's going to be, yes, that's more or less what I want to say. So the sub-conclusion is, if one conceives of causation as a relation between salient variables that systematically correlate under certain interventions, naturalist dualism does not necessarily result in epiphenomenalism, because qualia are the kind of states on which we can systematically intervene in order to systematically bring about effects. Pain being one of my favorite examples. If you systematically intervene in my pain states, you're going to have systematical changes in my behavior. And if you have this kind of view, it's not that weird to say that the actual world contains more causes than the zombie world, namely the qualia. You have more salient variables, the intervention upon which correlates with systematical results. And it is motivated by considerations independent of the issue of mental causation, namely omissions and Thymus symmetry of causation. So it is therefore more promising or more motivated than Criddle's view. The main problem, I think, with this view is that if you look at interventionist accounts of causation, the whole notion of intervening is sort of constructed around the idea that interventions only affect the variable you intervene upon. And if you take that, so the idea is this: something is a necessary and sufficient condition for X to be a type level direct cause with regards to a variable set. If there is a possible intervention on X that will change Y, or the probability distribution, when one holds fixed at some value all the other variables, but in an intervention on my quale, holding fixed all other variables will still result in nothing. That's the idea that the naturalist dualists have. If some sort of godlike creature would came in and just sort of tampered with my pain quale and leaves physical states where they are, the effects will still be the same. So we're still more or less in the same position as Krödel again. We're getting right. Now there are some exceptions to this holding fixed condition. For example, you can be expected to intervene on a macro variable without intervening on the micro variables underlying it. So if I want to intervene on the position of that chair, of course I'm going to intervene on the position of the molecules in that chair. So if there is, for example, some sort of supervenience between the two, then we can sort of relax this idea of holding fixed. This is also what Woodward himself proposes later on. Now, in my